I know that some areas are unfortunately going through some terrible weather. I did receive a note from Karen at St. Mary's University in Nova Scotia that she was expecting to lose power and wouldn't be able to likely to be able to attend. But thank you very much to everyone else who has power and is able to be here today. As I said, my name is Doug Ronson. I'm with ESQ Educational Services, and we organize workshops for homestay coordinators across North America. And as some of you who attended the Toronto workshop have met Madeline Golda before, she gave an excellent presentation on cross-cultural communication at the Toronto session. And we particularly wanted to focus in this webinar on cultural reentry, on helping students who perhaps have gone home for the holidays and are going to be returning soon and going to be perhaps feeling some culture shock. And Maddie will explain more about that during the webinar, but we particularly wanted to hold this webinar now so that when students return to classes in the next week or two, we have the opportunity to help them to adjust as best as we can. So at this point, I'd like to thank Madeline for giving the webinar, and I'd like to turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to go through one more item of housekeeping. For those of you that have just joined, starting our webinar, you should be able to see a purple screen at the moment, which is our presentation screen. And if you can, during the webinar, please just keep your microphones muted. And then if you have a question, you can jump in and ask the question. We like to leave questions till the end, if that's okay. And you also have a chat box on your webinar screen for those of you that are on our computer, where you can type in questions there. For now, if you can just let me know if you're on the phone, if you could type that in, or just unmute your microphone. Just let me know if you're on the phone, because then I'll read more of the screen for those of you that are dialing in. And when we have questions and when you pose questions, there will be some, a few seconds while I wait for answers. And don't be afraid of silence on a webinar. It's one of the tricks of doing a webinar. You may hear silence a little bit more often. So let's jump right in. And one of the first things I wanted to point out is, again, revising our stages of cultural adjustment. A quick review. The first stage is our honeymoon period, where the students come out and they initially arrive very curious, very excited, absolutely thrilled to be doing it, hopefully. And to be honest with you, this particular stage can last just the flight and they arrive in the States and break down crying, or it can last the 2 weeks of orientation before they move in with their family. So there's huge variability in the length of time in how long the honeymoon period lasts. But I just wanted to remind you of that particular period, followed by culture shock, which we're going to dive into in another screen, followed by recovery, where the students start to build up and make friends and recover, and then adaptation. And the biggest one that we're going to talk about tonight is reverse culture shock, which we really need to examine before the kids come back next week. They're probably on flights in the next day or two coming back. So let's quickly remember the honeymoon period. They're excited, they're energetic, and generally speaking, there's a type of infectiousness with the students. So if you're hosting a student in your family and they arrive, there's general family excitement and, oh, let's meet the whole family, let's show you where the movie theater is, let's go bowling. So generally we have that kind of excitedness about the new guest in the house, right? So I want us to remember what that honeymoon period feels like. So if you as host family coordinators remember dropping the kid off at the house or bringing the student to the host family house, and you're busting with excitement as you introduce them or you're watching the family meet the student for the first time. I manage orientation for our several hundred students, and the biggest, most exciting day is when the kids are being actually meeting their host family for the first time, and it's so thrilling to watch them cry. But there's a general infectiousness that's there. The that excitement, because I want to talk about that later with reverse culture shock. So remember the honeymoon period, it's important. Then the kids dive into culture shock, and there's many different facets of this, but they struggle with using the foreign language. They're not sure who's in charge. They're not sure, is the father figure in charge or the mother figure in charge. They're not sure how to react to people in authority. And what comes with that as well is the fact that Americans and people in North America tend to be very informal. Teachers dress down. The principals of the school might not be as formally attired as what we're used to in an international classroom. So they're not quite sure how to interact with people in authority. They definitely struggle with trying to make friends and trying to understand friendships. And typically on this side of the Atlantic, we tend to see a lot of sarcasm and weird kind of humor in when we're making friends here, and that can be very difficult for that international student who's just moved over to this side of the world. Not having a clear idea of how to date people, and maybe they have boyfriends or girlfriends far away. So that's a big struggle, especially for a teenager. Good Lord. Not being understood when they're trying to express themselves. So when you move country, and even if the language is still the same as your language, you can feel somewhat muted because of the cultural shock. That phase you go through in culture shock is just not really feeling okay with expressing your opinion. So you can feel sort of muted, where you wouldn't speak up and say, oh my God, isn't that silly? Whereas you might do that at home. And we're going to come back to that later. Finding the food and the customs are different. So those are quite obvious ones. Religious practices are different. Certainly some of our students from China, for example, are just not familiar with religion at all and don't necessarily understand the dedication we might have to this side of the Atlantic. And then the big differences between the educational systems are really tough for them, but they do get over that quite quickly. Now, one of the reasons why our teenage kids get over differences in the educational system very quickly is because they're with their peers. So I need you to remember that. Adjusting to culture shock, the kids will move through the adjustment phases a lot more quickly if they're with people their own age, people that look like them, same height, same kind of interests. Even if they're North American or Chinese or Korean, it doesn't matter. If they're with their peer, their age group, they tend to get with the flow a lot more quickly. So you'll find that they might adjust quickly to figuring out the lockers and figuring out the lunch at school, but they're still struggling with something in the host family home. But in the host family home, they might be living with two older people, maybe two empty nesters. So they might struggle more there, whereas what they get into is a groove pretty quickly at school because they're with their peers. So let's remember that for reverse culture shock, okay? Now, finding that people in the new culture are impatient with them and they're not able to express their opinion as quickly, they're not able to answer the question quickly. Oh, do you like fish? Do you like chicken? Do you like potatoes? And the English gets stuck. Do you remember I mentioned that at the conference in Toronto? The English can get stuck and they're not sure how to reply very quickly. So there's a certain amount of impatience they become used to when they move into a new country. Finding that there's prejudices here that they weren't familiar with. So, you know, when I left Ireland, all of a sudden people were saying to me, oh, you must drink and you must be Catholic and you must be an awful fighter. But nobody's ever said that to me in Ireland because everybody drinks over there. So, you know, when you move country, you become aware of all these prejudices that you might not have heard spoken about before. So remember that about culture shock, and we're going to come back to some of those things for reverse culture shock. Now, when you're going through culture shock, loads of feelings are kind of tumultuously turning around inside your belly. Anxiousness, homesick. Homesickness never goes away. It hits you at the most unexpected times and with things that you wouldn't expect to. You might see somebody wearing a Fitbit watch that a cousin of yours has in your home country, and all of a sudden you get a pang of homesickness when you've been doing absolutely great for 3 weeks. So homesickness is a very sneaky little thing that pops up when you're least expecting it. And as a teenage boy or girl, right, all of our kids coming over for high school and staying with home family, they can feel angry, they can feel lonely, helpless, overwhelmed. When I say unsure of yourself and fearful for your safety, that is something that immigrants tend to have more so than native country residents who move to a different state or county. It's very typical for immigrants to feel unsafe more than other people. And that's a typical immigrant feeling that we might get. They definitely feel less competent. I mean, we're dealing with kids that come to North America to improve their English, to get a better school system, and they scored 90 on the TOEFL. So they're awesome. They got into the school, but all of a sudden the English is stuck when they move here. So really causing a big, can really cause anxiousness when they move here. Certainly they're going to feel like they don't belong, and that's difficult for them. Where do they belong now? They don't really belong in the host family home or in the school, and they're kind of settling in with that culture shock. Fearful for the unknown and the unfamiliar. Again, that sense of being afraid of something. And then definitely they're going to feel confused about what values to live by. So what I mean by this is, in their native country, they might value sitting down and having a long meal. They might value a different way to meet people. So those are all cultural differences that these students can really struggle with when they come here. And there's general confusion about, do I become more American, more North American, or do I stick to my guns and be stubbornly Asian? So we can think about some stereotypes there as well to help us understand that. And then definitely unsure about whether to stay or whether to go back to their main country. So they always have those choices. Do they want to study for 1 year? Do they want to study for 4 years? Do they want to study in college here as well? So all of these feelings they're going through in the culture shock phase, and it's very confusing. Now the next part of this is, not only are they feeling that here, but they feel a little bit unsure of now how to relate to their native friends in their own country. So when you move to a new country but you meet fellow natives in your new abode, how do you approach them when you may never have actually met them in your native country? You may not associate with somebody from a different class in your native country, but now that you're all Chinese or you're all Indian and you're all living here together, the expectation is that you're going to become friends. And that can be a difficult expectation, and you're struggling with that. So you may have to be friendly with a fellow Chinese person, a fellow Indian person, when you really wouldn't have been able to stomach them back home. And that's tricky, right? That's a difficult thing to do. And I'm going to come back to that in reverse culture shock as well. So let's move on to the next sort of phase that we go through with cultural adjustment is adaptation. So all of those previous, those feelings that we have here, they tend to settle a little bit. So I begin to kind of understand the differences between the new country and my home country, and cultures, and I settle in. I become a little bit more flexible, a little bit more tolerant of what's going on here, and definitely more confident. So with culture shock, it can be a very short phase. I've met students who are very confident and they push through it like just in a couple of days, and they move on and they're able to talk about things. If their English proficiency is higher and they're able to express themselves better, they tend to get through culture shock a little bit more quickly. So if their English proficiency is higher, but they're a shy person that doesn't want to talk about things, it will halt or delay their pushing through the culture shock phase as well. So English proficiency levels plus willingness to talk can affect how quickly they go through these phases, not just English proficiency by itself. So when you move into the adaptation phase, a bit more confident, a bit more mature, a bit more flexible, able to figure out what's going on. So it's an adaptation is a nice phase to get into, and hopefully they're talking about it more. Now, last phase, right? Recovery. They definitely are now straddling both cultures with a good sense of confidence. But they can also actually talk about what they went through in the culture shock phase and the honeymoon phase. And they have a good sense of where they can get help, who they talk to for help. They're reaching out a little bit more. So that's why I put that line in there. They gain a better understanding of external and internal resources. Sometimes when you talk to a student who's in recovery, they might say, when I'm stressed, I like to listen to music. When I'm homesick, I like to listen to Chinese movies or movies in Chinese. Some, you might talk to a student like, oh no, I went to see that movie, or I waited to see that movie at home so I could watch it in Chinese, or I could use the Chinese subtitles. That's a student who's moving into the recovery phase, because now they're getting an understanding of what the resources are that they can use to kind of get through what they're doing here. So watch out for those comments from the students. I hung out with my Chinese friends, but I'm actually going to go and have coffee with an American friend now. So that's a student that's balancing those resources into it. So when they move here in end of August, beginning of September, you'll see these phases very strongly. You'll see sample sentences, sample experiences from each phase. And, at a further point down the road, we can do webinars where we look at each phase and we can pick out experiences from each one. And now what happens is recovery can be very quickly, like October, November. And then even December might be kind of when you start to see a bit of recovery. But what happens is they go home for the Christmas break. And now we have a slew of other issues that happen. So in Christmas break, we know that the students are comfortable with their new culture and they've adapted to what's happening here in North America. So they know that they can maybe hug their host family. They know that they can fist pump the American students in the classroom. They can say high five. They can act out, act kind of cool. And then when they go home back to their native country, all of a sudden they get a massive culture shock going back to their native country. And they actually have another adjustment phase to go through. When they go back home, their family and their friends are not prepared for this student being changed. And that's a really big issue. So this student might go back to their home and want to talk about America, or might be busting with excitement about talking about it. Life has gone on at home. And that's really, really hard for them. So when they go back home, let's just have a quick look at the definition of reverse culture. Is primarily the set of emotional reactions to the loss of reinforcements from one's own culture. So it's kind of like the rug is pulled out from underneath them about what they grew up in. And that's difficult. So now they have to find their footing again at home. And they may feel irritable. They may feel helpless when they go back home. But they'll definitely feel sort of cheated out of what went on at home. Plus, they might have a feeling of contamination. And I love this word contamination because they're going to be bringing back to their home country their body language, their smiles, their outgoing nature, their reaction to certain things that they've picked up from the host family, which is going to be very foreign from what they grew up with in their family. So if we look at this definition here, we talk about contamination, about feeling cheated, and those are very unique feelings to reverse culture shock. When we talked about culture shock previously, it's the culture shock of coming into a new culture, different from your native country, but reverse culture shock has the additional layers of the fears of being cheated, feelings of contamination, feelings of upset that they're bringing back into their family when their family and their culture in let's say, China or other is not ready for that to come back. So here's the hook with reverse culture shock, right? When they go back home, the parents can be resentful of that new student's personality. The parents might be kind of like, why did you just do that? What was that all about? So let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I've been to China, and I've sat in a restaurant which is absolutely packed. And because I was waving my hands around or laughing out loud, the whole restaurant turned around and stared at me. So it can literally be something as simple as that. The fact that I smile a bit bigger than a typical Chinese person, or I wave my hands around a bit bigger. But that is something that the Chinese kid can pick up very quickly from a host family, that it's okay to smile, it's okay to be outgoing, it's okay to wave your hands around. Or can you imagine a very big outgoing Italian family breakfast, And having an international student sitting at that table, it's quite infectious to sit at the Italian family breakfast. Excuse me, picking on the Italians if we have some Italians on the webinar, but it's infectious to sit there. You feel like moving around and being more active, and your student can absorb those things. But when they bring those behaviors home, the parents can be resentful of it. The parents can be looking at the students' grades and seeing that the grades are lower. I guarantee you, every international student that comes here will get lower grades. You must say that up front to the students when they arrive. You're a straight A student. It's wonderful to meet you. I guarantee you, you will not be getting straight A's for this first semester. And they need to be woken up to that fact as soon as they arrive. So they can feel genuine resentment from the parents. They can also feel extreme pride from the parents. We especially find this in parents who themselves have studied in North America. They tend to be quite, they seem to be quite more, a bit more tolerant of the students' cultural changes and behavior changes when they come home. So that's interesting. I've met some parents who are okay with it just because they did it themselves. But they can still be somewhat resentful. They don't want their kid to change completely. They understand that they're learning a new culture, but they don't want them to change completely. Another issue that we see with reverse culture shock is the students' own friends might be jealous, genuinely jealous of what they're experiencing in America. So, you can imagine this student going back home and saying, well, in Montreal, we do this. In New York, we do this. So you can definitely have massive issues of jealousy there. And in addition to that, remember, these students' friends and families, their lives have moved on. Your student can feel lost when they go home. This is their first time back on soil, but they are a different person. They have changed and things have gone on. They may have missed weddings, they may have missed birthdays, they may have missed celebrations. They can definitely be confused about now looking at things that they grew up with that they thought that were really cool, but now they come back with a fresh set of eyes and think, oh, that's icky. I'm glad I don't see that anymore. And that's really a big issue, is that the students can come back to their native country and say, these things I grew up with are worse, or these things are better than what I can see in North America. And that's a really big adjustment issue for them. They're definitely going to feel lonely that stuff has gone on without them. And now they're not sure where they fit in at home. So these are all of those negative feelings that they can have when they go back. But it's really quite tumultuous. And I guarantee you that every student is going to have a little bit of at least one of these things. Many times it's exciting for them to go home. And one student told me, that when he went home for Christmas, that he was expecting everybody to celebrate him coming home. He was expecting to get all the attention when he went home because he hadn't been there in 4 months. And in fact, he got no special treatment. Life just went on. They kind of just turned around and kept having dinner and everything. So he was actually disappointed that he wasn't pedestalized a lot more when he went home. So I thought that was an interesting twist to it as well. So that's typical of what can happen at home. Now, good Lord, they then spend a few weeks at home and then they have to come back to America. And here's the biggest issue: when they return to this side of the Atlantic, they now may feel genuine disdain for things that they got used to as they moved through the first 4 cultural stages. So you may end up having a conversation with a student that they're complaining about something, and your reaction might be, well, hey, wait a minute, I thought you were okay with that. I thought we spoke about that in September. What are you talking about? That's not the right thing to say to that student, because what they're going through is reverse culture shock. For example, I don't want to take the bus to school. I don't like that I have to be dropped off first. Something like that. Or I don't like having lunches at the school. Well, wait a minute, I thought we got over this in September. I guarantee you that is a part of reverse culture shock. They're going to have to readjust to things that they got used to. They're going to feel sort of alienated and withdrawn, and they may have to be pulled out of their shell a little bit more. They're definitely going to need a ton more sleep when they get back. Now, we know that sleep is a very, very healing process chemically for our brain. It helps readjust the second language area of the brain. As I mentioned in Toronto, when stress goes up, the second language area of the brain shuts down and your second language gets stuck. And a really good way to reset that part of the brain is to sleep. But with reverse culture shock, we tend to see the kids need a lot more sleep to get through these sorts of phases. So do let your host families know, let the kids sleep. I don't want them on the screen till 3 in the morning. I need them to sleep. In addition, in North America, we have that lovely thing called winter, where there's no sunlight for an incredibly long period of time. So these kids need to get out in the light, and if possible, midday when the sun is stronger. But I do recommend that the kids buy the sun lamps in the morning that help them wake up. You can find them on Amazon, but they are those alarm clocks built into a round light. So by the time the alarm clock goes off, the light has been coming on for about 10 to 15 minutes, so it replicates the sunrise in your bedroom. So by the time you wake up, your brain is actually awake. It makes a tremendous difference to a teenager's brain to be woken up by light in that way. I highly recommend them. The last I checked, they were $80. I actually did get my own here in my house, and they work tremendously. So when you're dealing with your student who comes back, communication may seem difficult again. Now, the reason for this is, as they're going through their first initial phase between September and December, and they're going through those first 4 phases of cultural adjustment, they're getting used to expressing themselves and getting used to having an opinion and talking. So that's great. But then they go back home for Christmas, and when they're there, all of a sudden they're busting with conversation, and their mutedness that they felt maybe September and October is completely gone. So they've been expressing opinions and talking with ease in their native language for that 10-day break. So now what happens when they return back into their second language, they have to actually do that chemical shift in their brain where they're leaning on the second language part of the brain more than they were. So now they can actually go through a phase of reduced communication and reduced expression and reduced opinion creation in their second language because of reverse culture shock. So that's a little tricky as well. If you find the student is kind of not speaking up to you or not answering you, like, how's it going? They might not want to talk to you like that. So what I would do is bring a new cookie to the student and say, hey, how do you like this cookie? Just so you get the student in the habit of expressing an opinion again, which sounds like a simple trick, but it does actually work. Oh, look, listen to this new Taylor Swift song. Did you see Taylor Swift's concert on YouTube last week? It was so silly. And that just gets them, their heart, in the mode of expressing an opinion again, and gets that communication tap. It's like a squeaky tap or faucet. You call them faucets. Where the faucet is all squeaky and rusty, and you got to unrust that faucet. So asking an opinion about something else before you hit them with the big question is a great way to do it. Now, on top of that, they're going to feel like people don't understand them again, and they're going to feel muted again because they've just spent the whole last 2 weeks yakking away to family and friends. So when you look at the physical differences, what happens with the student when they're traversing the Atlantic, what's different for them? The noise levels are different. If they're from a city in China, it can be constant noise. If they're from a quieter place, a lot of the students in China, for example, live in apartments and high-rise apartments, and it's very noisy all the time. The hours of sunlight are different. The weather's different. The racial makeup of the population is something that does shock the kids again, because when they move back in January after Christmas, there's no honeymoon period. So the students' tolerance of racial differences is lower. So when you first move here at the end of August, September, and you're in that honeymoon period, you tend not to be as shocked about things because you're like, oh, this is North America. This is, of course, I'm going to see people of different colors and different races. Oh, isn't this cool? Whereas when you come back in January, you don't have that honeymoon period to light your fire. So you tend to look at the racial differences and go, oh, really? So you're a little less tolerant. It's kind of how if you had to deal with an emergency situation, but you were tired, just a little bit more fatigued. So your tolerance of certain things would be lower if you were like that too. So smells can be very different from them. And I remember that the few times that I've been in China, just the smell of the food would actually put me off food because the smell of the food was something I'm not used to. So smells can create a sense of difference for me, and I'm just a little less tolerant of it in January when I come back because I don't have the honeymoon period there to get me through. And the pacing of life is different. Depending on the differences in their families, for example, if their native family is quite a slow pace of living and everything's organized and they take their time, and then they come back to North America and they're living with a host family that's got two other kids and everybody's busy and everybody's going to work first thing in the morning, that can be quite exhausting for them. And again, without the honeymoon period to get them through the understanding of the differences in the paces of life, it's a lot more difficult. But it can really throw them when they come back in January after spending that time at home. So again, you may end up with conversations with your students and you may say to them, I thought you were okay with that. Wait a minute. I thought you were fine with that. You knew you had a busy host family. You knew there was 4 kids in the family. What do you mean you want to move to a new host family now in January? So you can actually see students coming up with excuses to move. They want to move host families in January, and it's for stuff that you think they should have gotten used to. That is a symptom of reverse culture shock. And that is a reason not to move out of that host family home and move into another host family home. They will adjust. They need to get used to it. Or they might be saying things, well, I knew about it the whole time. That, I've heard this from students in January saying, no, I didn't like it the whole time. I just didn't tell you. But now that I went home and I spoke to my family about it, they said I should move. So I've heard those types of conversations in January, which are actually reflective of reverse culture shock, not an issue with the host family. So be warned. Okay, so here's another thing I want to tell you about with reverse culture shock. When they've adjusted September, October, November, if they're getting used to English as a second language, which is different from English as a foreign language, right? They got 90 on the TOEFL, whoop-de-doo, but now that they've got English as a second language going through the second language area of the brain, English is more tricky. But when they go home for those 10 days to 2 weeks and they return back, what happens is it shifts the student into a kind of a separate plateau of self-awareness of language. They actually come back and realize, oh my gosh, I've got so much more English to learn. I'm really bad at English, because what they've done for those 10 days is speak very fluently with their native family in their native language. So they've been full of opinions, they've had arguments, they may have broken up with their boyfriend or their girlfriend. But when they return in January, we see this phase of language acquisition where their self-awareness of their language proficiency is very elevated, which means they really cop on about how much more English they have to learn. And they struggle with that. They can actually get very depressed about it. It can actually be a really difficult phase for them to go through that they're struggling with. So in this phase, I tell host families, please keep the subtitles on the TV. Get the students to come in and watch TV with you with the subtitles on. Try and make it a family event. I ask the students, please, 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 listen to audiobooks daily. But they must listen and read at the same time. Not just listen to audiobooks in the car, but listen and read at the same time. Now, if you can have the students download Audible onto their mobile device, they can go ahead and download some books on there. And I don't care what books they read. I don't care if they read a really bad book. I just want them to do some kind of book, some kind of audiobook daily, but reading and listening at the same time. So you could download the book on your Audible app. That's Audible, and then actually go get the book in the library. So you physically have the book with you, but you've also downloaded the audiobook. I need them to, be praised for their English specifically. And this is important when you meet with your students, to say to them, not just, oh, your English has improved, but I actually want you to point out what they did well. So for example, oh, I like the way you used that word in that sentence. Oh, I like the way you asked me that question. You said that question perfectly. So I'd rather you praise their English specifically so they've got something to hold on to, right? As opposed to a general statement, oh, your English is doing really well with your English. That's a little bit vague for somebody that might use a bit more anchor when they return in their reverse culture phase. What I also want to remind you is social interactions are very important when they come back with their peers, but also in a casual setting. If you only meet your students while they're in school time, they might feel reticent to speak with you. But if you were responsible for a big group of students, maybe you could take them to the movies, maybe you could take them out bowling, maybe you could play some sort of games with them, have like a Scrabble, after school Scrabble half an hour session with them once a month, just so you can interact with them in a setting that's considered more social to them. And one thing that I like to recommend as well for the students in this particular phase is to help them maybe make a photo album or buy them a picture frame or one of those whiteboards, the thick stock cardboard boards. If you could help them make a photo album of new and old friends, of family and host family. So maybe do something physical like that and write a journal and maybe put some paragraphs on that board for them and say, okay, now that you've gone home for the first time since you took the big step of studying abroad, let's put a photo album together and maybe make that your as your host family coordinator, maybe make that your January project with them next week if you could. What I saw at home and what I've learned in the US, before and after project or presentation on one of those big white stock trifold cards would be great to help them kind of balance both cultures and straddle both things. And then one thing that always works is if you can have these kids somehow become teachers. And a great way to do this is to have the older students talk to the younger students, or a returning student talk to a new student via Skype or in person, or somehow get them to collaborate about their travel experience and what it means to travel abroad. One of the projects one of the schools did, which I thought was great, is they had the international kids go and talk to elementary school kids in their school district in another school building, but they actually had them go and do an after school session for a Tuesday afternoon and talk to the elementary kids about what it was like to live in their native country. And it would be great if you could do that in January, because it's going to help push them through the reverse culture shock phase. Now, what we tend to find with the reverse culture shock phase is that it can last longer than any of the other phases that they went through between September and December. They can actually become depressed. So making them teachers of their learning experience pulls them out of that very, very quickly. And it's a great way to do it. So I'm not sure if you have that kind of leverage in your school district or if you have those connections, but I've seen that work really, really well when they return. Okay, so when they come back, what you can tell your host families is, besides all of this great information, host families really create their honeymoon activities. What I mean by that is when they first arrived with their host family, the host family might have introduced them to the entire extended family, might have taken them bowling a couple of times, might have taken them to the movies. I have mentioned bowling a couple of times, but I do think bowling is a great activity because I'm useless at it. But multiple people of multiple ages and skill sets can do it and actually still have fun. So I think it's a great group activity overall. Golfing and things like that. I mean, you're just going to miss the ball if you're used to golfing, but with bowling, the odds are that you're going to hit something. Hopefully not your family members, but hopefully some of the pins. Anyway, what I say to host families is recreate the honeymoon activities in January. Build up that excitement again when they come back. So whatever you guys did to introduce that student to everybody, do it again. Absolutely do it again. Make that honeymoon feeling come back. Keep up with regular activities. What I really think is important for our host families to do is to have a regular weekly activity that they commit to. For example, maybe board game night or Scrabble night or leftover night. I don't care what it's called. I just want them to have a regular activity. And what that does is it just opens up a comfortable avenue for that student to be able to engage in. So let's just say you go bowling every 2 weeks. The second time you go bowling with that international student, they're going to talk a little bit more. The third time, they're going to get more confident. The fourth time, they're going to be even more confident. So now they're going to talk up a little bit more. So it's okay to have regular activities that they can engage in. Now, I also want them to make time for English only activities. That's okay to do. Where, tonight's dinner, it's English only. Tomorrow night is Chinese dinner, so everybody at the table is going to learn Chinese. Make time to learn a little bit of Chinese. I always ask the host families that. And then make sure the host families can stick the Chinese words on the wall or stick the English words around the kitchen and label the entire house with the English and the Chinese. And it's okay to make time for the native language. It's okay for them to do that. And absolutely, they need to talk about the experience of going home with their host family. And if they can get the student to cook their own food or, talk about the recipes that they learned at home. What I like to do is have a traffic light symbol in my house. So tonight is a red night, which means it's English only. Orange night is we can switch between both languages. If you need to translate, we can use the translator. And then green night means that we have to try and speak your language. So having a traffic light in the kitchen, just to print it up on a piece of paper on the table helps the kids push them into it and also allows them to speak Chinese when they want to. Now, the last thing I want to mention, which I'm not going to get into too long here, is the masks. What we mean by this is the behaviors that teenagers will project when they're not comfortable with something, but they don't want to talk about it. So very quickly, you can have the mask of being the good Samaritan, the person who's always helping everybody else before they help themselves. The contemptuous mask. So you might get the eyeball roll. I don't know if you've got teenagers in your house, but I get a lot of eyeball rolls in my house. I have 4 teenagers. The strong silent mask, the perfection mask, the person that always wants to be perfect before they do anything. The kid who's always ill or frail, poor me, I can't do it. So those are all types of masks that teenagers can use. And we can talk about these further down the road and how it affects the behavior. Other masks are being, helpless, invisible, the clown, acting around. You might have a very outgoing one. So sometimes we need to dig through these masks that we see in our students. Stop jumping around, stop misbehaving. What is it that's really bothering you? Please talk to me. So masks can be quite complex, and you've got different masks for different ages and different genders even possibly. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is a couple of great books that I love about this type of subject matter. And The Art of Crossing Cultures is a very nice book about moving country, that sort of thing. Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria is a great read about psychology and why all the different kids from different cultures will sit together and cluster together and why they do that. Kiss, Bow, or Shake Hands. I absolutely want everybody in the world to have a copy of that at their desk. It's a great book. It has about 50 countries in it, and it has about 10 pages on each country, and it tells you whether to kiss, to bow, or to shake hands in that country culture. It's a really important book for us to have. You cannot make the assumption that somebody from one part of China is exactly the same from another part of China. Beyond the Tiger Mom is an excellent read. A woman who lived in India and China and in England, and she had her kids go to different school systems across different continents. So it was really fascinating to read that. And Kluge is a wonderful short read about how completely quirky and weird our brains are and how difficult they are. So those are just some good books to read on the subject that I wanted to let you know about. And a couple of good websites as well, which I like. IIE, the International Institute of Education, and NASFA.org are also some great websites for international students. And on there, you'll find more books and publications that are interesting to read. And you can also buy boxes of publications that you could distribute to your host families. On the NASFA website in particular, they have got some great publications that you can buy in bulk. They've got booklets on cultural adjustment and things like that. You could buy a set of 50 and have them ready for your host families. So that's it from me. I'm going to go back to the book screen, and let me know if you want to switch between these two resource screens for you. At this point, please feel free to ask a question or to type it in the box below, and let's have a discussion if you want to. And we will wait quite a while, so don't be worried about rushing in.
Okay, well, thanks, Maddie, for that excellent presentation. I think there was a lot of valuable information there. We do have one question to start off with. Do you find that the issue of reentry is more challenging with certain cultures? You talked a fair bit about China, but are there particular cultures around the world that are either more likely to be vulnerable to reentry issues or less likely to be?
That's a good question, Doug. And I probably did mention China a lot. The last year of my life has been mostly with Chinese kids. And the last 15 years of my life has been with students from all over the world. So I have seen the biggest difference between the Chinese parents and American parents. And that's the cultures are just so different. The cultural values are very different. The conversation styles are very different. Paralinguistic features are quite different. Body language, eye contact. When we see big differences in the cultures between those two areas, paralinguistic skills and cultural norms, then we see bigger issues with reverse culture shock. So when I talk about paralinguistic features of a culture language, I'm talking about the distance between our bodies when we speak. I'm talking about eye contact. I'm talking about touching and conversation styles. So if you're dealing with a culture that's quite different from North American culture in those areas, we'll see bigger reverse culture shock issues. For example, if you had an Irish student returning to North America, because their paralinguistic features are so similar, we won't have as many issues. With Asian students, we tend to have quite big differences in paralinguistic features. And also with Arabic students from some cultures that are Arabic, for example, Egypt will be quite a westernized culture, so there won't be as big a differences, but certainly Saudi Arabia would have big differences. So it depends on the culture, but for sure I'm seeing big issues with the Chinese students. I did mostly speak about teenagers, but adults do have these similar struggles. So one of the questions that was just popped up here is, do adults have the same issues? When we talk about second language acquisition, the adult brain is the age of 14 and up. So when I talk about the struggles linguistically, it does apply to high school and teenage kids and adults. So that feeling of being muted, that feeling of not being able to express an opinion or complain, or realizing how much English I still have to do, that applies to any brain over the age of 14. What we do find with adults is that they tend to be able to become more flexible more quickly than the teenagers. And the adults are not as affected by peer pressure in a negative way. So those are the difference between the teenagers and the adults.
Okay, thanks, Maddie. Another question that we had was, you sort of touched a little bit about food, but what are some of the things that host families can do when students are re-entering? Are there certain food, are there certain approaches to food that host families can take when students come back from their home country?
Yeah, last year I worked with some host families, and I asked the host families to stay in touch with their student when the student returned to their native country. So the host family did a couple of FaceTime sessions while the student was at home, and I thought that was a good thing to do. But absolutely, one of the best things I've seen to be quite successful is to have the host family bring the student shopping with them, and not only to the stores that they normally go to, but to a culturally different store. Like if they had a Brazilian market or an Indian market or a Chinese market store, actually bring the student with them so that the student can pick out foods that they want to help cook with. And we definitely have found quite happy students when they're able to cook and help themselves and help plan the menu. And for example, with Chinese students, the food is incredibly different all across all the regions of China. So I would ask that host families don't make the assumption that they know what foods that student's going to like, because there's such huge differences in India and China, and even in Brazil. In Ireland, it's the same food, north, south, east, or west. It's potatoes and meat, that's it. But in China, you've got massive differences. So you must bring your student shopping with you and have them participate somehow in the cooking. They may not want to actually do the cooking, but absolutely have them make the choices. And that really, really helps students adjust.
Oh, great. Thanks, Maddie. And I don't see any other questions here. So perhaps, Maddie, you'd just like to give a quick wrap up of the presentation, and we'll close off for the evening.
Yeah, so just to wrap up, as host family coordinators, don't be surprised by anything that your student says, especially if you've gone through it before with them, adjustment issues. And if you do get requests from students to change host family home, dig a little deeper, because it could be related to reverse culture shock. And the instances that I've experienced where the kids have wanted to move host family homes was definitely related to reverse culture shock when it comes in. And anyone that's lived abroad, it's probably the worst phase to go through when you go home for the first time, because you realize that you've left home and it's different and you're different. So home has kind of been taken away from you to some extent. So I think of all of the phases, I think reverse culture shock is the most difficult. It is a struggle emotionally, physically, it's exhausting, mentally, it's draining, and traversing a language just makes that all the more complex. So even though you feel as a host family coordinator, oh, this kid has been here for 4 months, they're used to it. It's still difficult, and it does affect people who live abroad. And so, Doug, I think there's one more question there.
Yes, yes, there is. Claire is asking, does it depend on how long you were in the new culture before returning home, the depth of your culture shock?
Yeah, that's a great question, Claire. And if that's a great question, the question is, how long do you have to be away from home before you return home, and then it gets affected? That I think if you travel abroad and it's just a vacation, even if it's a month-long vacation, if you're in vacation mode, you're in honeymoon mode for that whole time. and you're staying in hotels and you're just on a big wild trip, I don't think you're going to have the same negative effect when you return home. But if you've moved to a different country for a purpose, such as studying for an entire year, and you're living and you're embedded in the host family situation, I think the key here is actually living with the host family for longer than a month. Now you're being embedded in that culture and you're absorbing that culture. And there's a purpose to living here. It's your life now. It's not just a grand vacation. I could definitely go on vacation for 6 months. I'd be delighted. But I wouldn't have that effect on it because of the purpose of my trip. So if the purpose of my trip is a move and an embedding into a host family here and absorbing a new culture, those are the affecting factors of it. I've met J1 students who are here for cultural exchange for 2 weeks to a month, and it's a honeymoon period for the entire time because it's not a long term for them. But for sure, if your students are moving here for longer than one semester, they're going to have this affect them tremendously.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Maddie. And wait a minute, Claire has another question. I was thinking more about those who have studied here for 6 or more months before returning. So what impact does that have?
Right. So that's a great question, Claire. I absolutely prefer that these students do not go back for Christmas at all. I want them to stay for a solid 8 to 9 months. And when they go back, they actually have a slightly less effect on the reverse cultural shock. When you travel home just after 3.5 to 4 months of being here, the language acquisition takes a massive hit and it can actually get into reverse mode. So when we affect language acquisition in that way, it affects the entire chemistry of the brain. So my preference is that the students do not return home at all. And if the host families don't want them for Christmas, I'd love if the host family coordinators could arrange something else for the students to do. Like go to Disney World for vacation for the few days over the Christmas break would be fabulous. So my recommendation is always to families, parents, and host family coordinators, don't let them go home at all. They're better off just staying for as long as they can. So if they stay for a solid year and then they go home for the summer, they actually have a lot more time to adjust to both cultures because they're in the foreign culture for 8 to 9 months, which is excellent. So they actually mature. Do you remember we mentioned in our adjustment phase, the students have flexibility and maturity? Those particular values and skills can be improved a little bit before they come back. So my preference is for them to stay over Christmas and not go back at all.
Great. Well, thank you again, Maddie, for an excellent presentation. And for those participants who took part, we hope you found it useful. We'd love to get your feedback. So if you would be willing, if you could just send us an email with some comments about the webinar, that would be terrific. And we are hoping to have more webinars in the future, and we'll certainly keep you informed as we schedule those in the future. So thanks again for everyone for attending, and thanks, Maddie, for your presentation.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody.